on the panel, and then Ruth will start our questioning. Sorry.
Yes, I'm Zoe Charlesworth, Head of Policy at Policy and Practice.
David Finch, Senior Research Fellow at the Resolution Foundation.
Tom Waters, I'm a Research Economist at the Institute for Fiscal Studies.
Great. Ruth?
Thank you very much. And start with a general question to each of you, and if one of you covers an area, then I'd be really pleased if the others could come in on different areas that you want to add to that, rather than everyone saying the same thing. But just to start us off, Zoe, do you want to let us know which groups you feel gain the most and which particularly groups lose out the most as they move to universal credit without transitional protection?
Yeah, we actually found looking at it in sort of the light of transitional protection quite complex, because obviously it's the circumstances that cause a move that will decide if income goes up or down. And you could say that some people are going to be better off, but they might not be as much better off as they would be if they'd stayed on legacy. So taking that into account, we thought the most apt way to look at it was to look at people who would lose under universal credit if you take out the change of circumstances. And our figures on that show that we would expect about 40% to be worse off, 30% to be better off, and about 30% much the same. And for those who are worse off, we're looking at an average loss of £59 a week.
And the better off ones, Zoe?
The better off ones, we're looking at £44 a week. So the ones we've got, the cohorts, if we're looking at groups of people, and obviously it does come down to individual circumstances, that some in these groups will actually be better off. But if we're looking at cohorts where the likelihood of being worse off is greater, the self-employed, obviously, with an average loss of £51 a week, and that's 0.64 million people. We think that 72% of self-employed people on benefit are likely to be worse off. Tax credit homeowners, an average loss of £37 a week, and we think that will affect 1 million households. And that'll be 90% of homeowners in receipt of tax credits. Disability, people with receiving PIP and DLA, so we're not talking about people who currently get ESA and are too ill to work, but people who are actually in receipt of PIP and DLA and so likely to get the premiums. We're looking at an average loss of £55 a week, and affecting 0.9 million or 78% of that cohort. Another group, such as people with over 16,000 on tax credits, they get quite a lot of protection under natural migration. There's it's only taking up a tenancy that's likely to ever affect this group, but they would all lose. We're looking at practically 100% of people with over 16,000. And another significant group is working lone parents, who would have an average loss of £8 a week. But that's only half of them. We're looking at quite a few of working lone parents, if they're earning, depending on the hours worked, will actually gain. The cohorts we saw as most likely to gain are employed, not self-employed, but employed households. And we would see those gaining on average £9 a week, but nearly half of employed households will gain. So for employed households, it's a really individual decision about whether they will need to know their circumstances. They'll need to have an assessment to make a decision. If they fall into one of the groups that has a choice of migration or not, it's not very easy to give advice without doing a full assessment to say which way they should choose. And of course, people on ESA, those on ESA support group gain. I haven't got the individual figures for the ESA support group, but most people on ESA will gain, even if they've got PIP or DLA within that. So we're looking at about £14 a week for people who are moving from ESA.
So can we just go back to those who are in work, the size of those who are losers and gainers, and the sums involved, please?
Yeah, for people in work, I think I've got the actual figures breakdown of all those in work. If you'll just give me a second to find them. I think it's very similar to the working lone parents. The average of £8 a week, I think, is what came.
What the gain is?
Losers. Loss. So the gainers, employed people, so people just in employment, we're looking at £9 a week, 1.2 million people.
And losers? in employment?
So 50% gain and 50% lose or have it very similar. But we've got very few losers. Lone parents, it's 50% loss, but for that other group who aren't gaining is split equally between those who have similar levels of support and those who are losing. So 25% similar level of support, 25% losing. So for the majority of working people, employed people, benefit will either stay the same or they will be better off under universal credit.
So the government's right in its assertion that it will benefit people in work?
For people, yes, I would say that when we've got 49% of people in work will be better off.
And is that full-time or part-time? Are you able to break it down beyond that?
We have done a breakdown, which I can send to you afterwards, of different types of work. But, of course, you've got groups within that whole lot of working people who are hit particularly badly, such as working lone parents, because they tend to do shorter hours. Because of the way that the taper works, those who work the longer hours are more likely to gain.
But when you say 49% better off, that would suggest 51% aren't better
Indeed.
off.
Indeed.
All right.
And yes, David, if you've got anything to add to that?
Yeah, I mean, I think
groups.
on the kind of similar thing where we're comparing what people would have in the tax credit system to what they would have with the same circumstances in universal credit, I think especially since the extra money that was put in at the last budget, we are now, in the past we used to see, you always had this mix of gainers and losers in working families, but more of them losing than gaining, and it has now flipped from our assessment to being more gainers than losers. And I mean, it's broadly in line with the kind of figures I think Zoe was talking about. You do still have some quite big gainers and losers within that mix, but I think the kind of, and the groups that we think are losing more are also similar with homeowners, self-employed, some under 25 parents, and then the people with savings or unearned income, which is basically where the rules in UC are very different to the system they're moving from. But I think the big thing is that that's very much an assessment of those people would stand to lose. If they don't manage migrate, they will lose the potential transitional protection they could get, which means if they then have another change in circumstances, similar to what they'd have in the natural migration, they're missing out on that potential cushion to that change. Whereas I think the idea of people actually having cash losses as they move on to universal credit from what they had before through the natural migration, there are cases, I mean the big ones were the severe disability premium, which is now kind of on hold. But it's largely, we think it's largely where people are moving house into a different local authority, and so and that's triggering that natural change in circumstance. If you're kind of in most other cases, your circumstances have changed to the extent that you're not actually having like a cash loss compared to what you had, but you are potentially worse off than you would have been if you'd had that change and stayed in the tax credit system.
Yes.
Tom?
Yeah, so I think the only thing I'd add is the way I think about it is there's a few broad demographic groups who on average gain or lose, though you do have winners and losers within that, and so some of them you've already heard. Lone parents on average tend to lose, working homeowners also tend to lose, whereas working renters tend to gain, and so do one-earner couples with children. But then there's a sort of more narrowly defined groups who can lose quite a lot. And so some of those you've already heard about, so low-income self-employed, those with financial assets, and some disabled claimants as well, although also some disabled claimants can gain.
Okay, thank you. And are there any particular areas that if we were looking to focus on, then those should be the people or the particular elements within universal credit that we should be focusing on to assist those who are still losing out? You want to start off for us, Tom?
I think that so some of the largest losers is notable. We all mentioned them, that low-income self-employed, and so that's the consequence of the minimum income floor in UC, which essentially assumes that people earn at least usually full-time at the minimum wage or living wage. I think it's pretty uncertain exactly how that policy is going to play out as we see more people moving on to UC, but those groups can lose a very large amount. And
a very large amount, you mean what, Tom?
It potentially could lose as much as £8,000 a year, I think, in the most extreme case.
Wow.
On average, it would obviously would be less than that. But yeah, we see really quite substantial losers there.
And are quite likely to have changes of circumstances. I've got some self-employed workers who work over the summer season. They've been doing Christmas jobs, and as they cease their Christmas job, it's triggered a move to universal credit, and that's then is hitting them very hard. So I think those groups are particularly likely to migrate under natural migration rather than managed, because they're quite transient groups.
Yeah, sure.
Yes, David.
So I think certainly the self-employed, and I think they are probably the biggest group with that kind of this sort of single characteristic left who would be losers. But probably more on a more specific point, I think this existence of a lower rate of the standard allowance in universal credit for under 25 parents, which is different to in the income support system, where if you're 18 plus you get the same high rate. I think those, especially on a transitional protection, where if your child turns 5 and you're moved into the JSA group from income support, which will actually be moving on to universal credit now, you will see this immediate drop in income. And that's a relatively straightforward change as well, because it's purely that rate at under 25. And that seems like something that will actually affect people at that point of migration, rather than a kind of hypothetical comparison to a kind of what they would have had in a different system, basically.
Yes, and also parents who have a baby when they're under 25, that will trigger. Yeah. If they were on benefit before,
if they were on JSA,
the claim. Yeah. Maybe we could ask some questions about how many or what proportion of parents have a baby or an additional child when aged under 25. See how many will be affected.
It's a miracle if we get a reply.
It shouldn't be beyond the wit.
It's amazing when you look at PQs what they do not have answers to.
We can give you the
we must remain optimistic.
Yeah. You got something on that?
I'm not sure if I've got it here, but we've got the...
You might send it in, that'd be right.
That would be really helpful.
And you as well. Yes, great.
Thank you.
Before we go on, Derek, do you want to come in on?
So, certainly years ago when this was first mooted, the universal credit, it was the self-employed group that were most concerned several years ago. And I'm trying to understand from you, hopefully, so if you're as Ruth described, self-employment isn't guaranteed income every month and it changes all over the place. How does the current system, how flexible is that in that situation? And what is the solution for universal credit for people on universal credit if they're self-employed? Because you're absolutely right, if you have got children and you're self-employed because that enables you to raise your children, that's unlikely to be full-time on minimum wage. So, and there's a real danger of us driving income to be hidden if we don't actually address this properly. So can you explain a bit about what happens under the current system? How flexible is it for people that have variations in income from week to week?
So at the moment, the tax credit assessment is similar to how self-employed report their income for tax purposes. So they're really taking the previous year's average. You can adjust that as you go if there are changes, but essentially you're averaging out the problem of varying income. Whereas in UC, because you're taking that monthly snapshot, you're completely ignoring the variation. I think when we've looked at it before, I suppose if you take the tax system as it is, then potentially it'd be just a lot easier to allow self-employed people to report their income on an average basis. But there is also a case, I think HMRC have tried to do this to make the kind of self-employed reporting for tax more digital. So if that does become more, if that reporting improves, then maybe you could switch to something like a 3-monthly average instead.
So that was really what I was getting at, was that with making tax digital, in theory, you would have real life data every 3 months.
Yeah.
So there's work that we could do as a committee to recommend that kind of adopts. Indeed. Carries across into welfare. Yeah. Thanks.
That would be much better than the monthly reporting that they're supposed to do at the moment on cash basis as well, and it would enable them to average out their expenses. So
great.
Aligning the two would be
great. Thank you.
Are we on the same calculation though? Because I remember there was a problem that what you had to report for tax purposes was not the same number you had to report for universal credit. So you have a slightly different calculation of income on both systems.
The universal credit is cash basis and tax is accounts basis. So, but if universal credit could become accounting basis.
Yeah, I think that's partly because they thought that was because you don't have the monthly data from the tax system, they thought that was an easier way to report it in universal credit. So I don't think there's a reason to not do that. And the other thing we haven't mentioned is the minimum income floor, which I think creates some of the problems the self-employed face because it bites in those periods where you have no earnings. So you can make a self-employed person who's earning the same as an employed person over a year worse off just because of how their income varies. So I think bringing that into an averaging basis as well, so it's more of a check that you are, because it's meant to be a kind of health check on businesses rather than, but as it works at the moment, it's more of a punitive thing just because of how it's calculated monthly.
Ruth?
Okay, and just turning to unearned income, what changes in the way it's treated? What impact does that have on claimants' income? Zoe, do you want to start on that one?
Yeah, unearned income is, I mean, even if you look at how the regulations are drawn, they're quite different in that under legacy benefits, they tended to say all unearned income, then take out exceptions and give quite detailed information on how each, within the schedules, about how each bit should be treated and whether there were disregards. Under universal credit is basically only the specified unearned incomes taken into account. And one of those specifications is income for tax purposes. So that's quite a broad one, but then there's other unearned income mentioned. But looking at it, if you look at how the regulations are drawn up, there are bound to be differences in how unearned income is treated. And whether, I sometimes think some of these are accidental, I don't know. But the other things that are different is under legacy benefits, there's disregards for certain unearned income, which just don't apply really, apart from the student grant amount, which has the amount for tuition fees and taken off, which is similar between housing benefit, for example, and universal credit. But also, for some of the legacy benefits, unearned income was added to earned income after the disregards on both sides, and then you had a tapering effect. Universal credit seems to be applying unearned income in the same way as ESA, JSA and IS, in that it's a pound-for-pound reduction. And the biggest, when we looked at unearned income, the biggest differences, people we found who would be affected by this mostly were those where had tax credits, income wasn't taxable and hadn't been taken into account for tax credit purposes. They moved to universal credit and those unearned incomes are now taken into account. And we did some case studies. I mean, for example, we've got a lone parent student who was claiming tax credits, who would lose £64 a week and she would get no universal credit on the circumstances, and we gave her very straightforward circumstances of rented property. And very few lone parents who were students who were getting tax credits will get support under universal credit because the loan and grant are taken into account. Another example is industrial injuries disablement benefit, where because it wasn't taken into account for tax credits, anybody receiving IIDB who was getting tax credits, their benefit under universal credit is likely to reduce if they get any. So a case we had was somebody with a 70% assessment of disability, a small bit of part-time work becoming £96 a week worse off. That's a significant amount. Spousal maintenance is the one that within our database is going to be have the most effect. There was a disregard in housing benefits that a certain amount of spousal maintenance was taken into account. In tax credits it wasn't taken into account. So if you're moving to universal credit, anyone receiving spousal maintenance, it will be taken into account and they will be worse off. And we did a few examples, and we've got £70 a week worse off for one of our examples. So these are significant amounts.
Zoe, do you not think that if we're going to move to a simpler scheme, then all income should be included for purpose of calculating eligibility for universal credit, but that one has a transitional protection for all those who are treated better than that, and current benefits should be, as long as they draw universal credit, treated in the same way, so that if you come onto it new, you would actually expect all your income to be taken into account.
Yes, I don't think it's unreasonable to expect all the income to be taken into account. I mean, I do think this is down but to policymakers. But
if you're working at heart, if you're turning out working, that income is taken into account, isn't it?
Yes, I'm just wondering if some of the, for example, spousal maintenance, does make sense to take it into account, and you're right, the shock is what you need to cushion.
I'm saying everybody who's currently drawing that under existing rules should be protected as long as they draw benefit, but at some stage one ought to begin to phase in under new rules.
Yes.
I mean, people are still being paid under the 1948 Industrial Injuries Scheme.
Yeah, I think if you look at
it is possible to do these things.
Yeah, if you look at it, some transitional protection does have end dates set on it. I mean, if you look at the one, the child support within income support tax credits, there was an end date set on it. So, but you do end up with some like incapacity benefit going into ESA that is still going on. So, yes, I mean, I think that's a really good point, and I do have. I think as long as the policy intent is the outcome is going to be as policy intended. I mean, for example, lone parent students. If you look at the policy ambitions for universal credit to move more people off benefit, that seems a strange one, but there may be a policy intent behind it. And in which case you need to, the emphasis should be on cushioning the shock to those households.
But if you're looking 10 years hence, and imagining we're doing this inquiry then, we ought to try to aim to get a simpler system, shouldn't we?
Yes, I think so. I mean, I think so. And it depends how quickly...
protecting people in the meantime. But protecting people in the meantime.
Protecting people in the meantime, yeah. And if you look at the regulations, it is simpler.
If spousal maintenance income is taken into account, is there an argument for maintenance paid also being taken into account in calculations? I mean, obviously in legacy system neither were taken into account, which seems reasonably fair. If it's taken into account as income in this but not as outgoings when it's paid, then does that skew the amount that's within those two families? That will skew the amount of money that can be afforded to be paid by the spouse or former spouse, and then what's received will also be reduced.
It's certainly
the children will lose out overall.
It's certainly one of those questions that always seems to come up when you talk to frontline organisations, as people see as deeply unfair that they're paying spousal maintenance and not taking into account. This is down to policymakers. I do actually feel that it's one that would be very hard to ensure is paid. And I think that's probably one of the reasons that it hasn't been taken into account.
Yes, but is often paid not regularly, so you could receive a lump of maintenance for 1 month that relates to several, and that will then skew your universal credit
indeed.
on the receiving end. But no, that's understood. Is there anything, David or Tom, you'd like to add to that on unearned income?
I mean, I think the main thing is largely Zoe was saying that a lot of the places where it's less generous is where it's working families, and the tax credit system tended to ignore most of this other income or treat it very leniently. And I suppose to some extent UC's trying to defend the insurance principle by imposing the kind of out of work rules on people in work. I think the one, I won't go into like all the different bits because those have already done this, but I do think specifically around maybe the spousal maintenance or the things like occupational or personal pensions where people may receive those for reasons of illness or disability, potentially you could treat those more leniently. And I think in the idea of a simplified future system, then I think there is a case that you should just treat all income the same, so it should all just be subject to the taper. And on savings, I think the rules for universal credit treating working people's savings more strictly than they did in the past are quite odd because of the time at which they were done, when there were lots of other schemes trying to boost savings through ISAs or the Help to Save scheme, which potentially could actually could mean that you get the reward from the Help to Save scheme, but then that reduces your universal credit to some extent as well. So I think there is something about whether it's some kind of isolated, like an ISA pot that isn't taken into account in universal credit or something, but something that does maintain that kind of incentive to save for families rather than it kind of reducing their UC.
Tom?
Yeah, can I just say, kind of connected to that? So, in UC, unearned income essentially is 100% taper. Your unearned income goes up by £1, your benefits go down by £1. Now, you could do, as David kind of was talking about just then, you could take all income together, doesn't matter whether it's earned income or unearned, and treat it as one. But there is a case for the government doing something at least more in the direction of what it's doing now, which is with earned income. The reason why why the government hasn't put in 100% taper is obviously it's worried about work incentives, right? It doesn't want people to go into work and then see no increase to their income. But when it comes to unearned income, you have less, arguably in many cases anyway, you have less control over the unearned income you receive than over the earned income you receive. And so you might be more worried about the incentive effects with respect to earned income than with respect to unearned income. And so that's potentially a case for tapering away with respect to unearned income more quickly than with respect to earned income, if that makes sense.
Yes, but if you're moving to a simpler system, it would be easier to have a single taper, wouldn't it?
Well, I suppose in general, in general with moving to simpler systems, you always have a bit of a trade-off that you can make a system simpler, but then that also doesn't allow you to kind of tweak things in ways that might be preferable. So you could have, I suppose, the most simple system would be just to have a flat benefit paid to everyone or something. But obviously we would.
No, we've done that one.
Yeah. So there's always this trade-off of simplicity versus trying to improve work incentives or target the most needy people, and so that's a trade-off policymakers have to make. But there is at least, I guess my point is there is a trade-off there.
If there's further thoughts you have on that, because that's clearly an area we will report on, would you submit ideas to us, please? Heidi.
Thank you. One of the biggest things that worries people is a perception that universal credit will make you worse off and accidentally being moved across onto it. And the government talks a lot about providing transitional protection for managed migration when that happens. But the purpose really of this session is about, because that's been delayed by a year, what about all the people who are going to naturally migrate across? So could I start off by asking the change in circumstances, the trigger that naturally migrates you across? Do you think those circumstances are reasonable, well explained, and how do they compare in reasonableness, if you like, to managed migration? Let's start with Zoe.
Yeah, and I think that it's, if you look at, got a very difficult situation. What they've tended to do, if you look at the triggers, what they tend to be is every single one of the 6 benefits, the triggers to losing one of those benefits have all sort of been amalgamated together. So, and you end up with, although the DWP will always talks about significant changes of circumstances, these aren't significant changes of circumstances in the minds of the claimants. Most people wouldn't see moving house within this area is okay, but that area is not okay. These are very difficult to explain to people.
2 miles that way or 2 miles that way.
Yeah, so it's very difficult to explain to people why some things will trigger a change and some don't. There doesn't. If you look at previous transitions of benefits, the transitional provisions are much more similar to what we would expect. So under UC, how UC you'd lose your TP under UC, are much more similar. But I think I'm not really sure how else they could have done it, because you've got to, if any of these 6 benefits end, you can't then claim. But it has caused some real difficulties for claimants. I think that most people, the transitional protection regulations I think most people would expect that if you lose your job, your claim comes to an end, there's a change in your relationship status, people would expect that to trigger a change. But some of the provisions around natural migration, your child reaching 5, well, that's probably significant to you as a mother, but you wouldn't think it was significant enough to cause a change of benefit.
So what are the big ones then? So moving house 2 miles that way rather than 2 miles that way.
Child reaching 5, I think that's a difficult one. Why is, we know why that birthday is significant. It's not so important. It's not so important to the claimants. First child, you're on the same benefit. You're having a first child. Why would that cause a trigger? And carers, I think the ones around carers are particularly, people wouldn't have expected that they become a full-time carer or they stop being a full-time carer, that they move to universal credit. So I think some of those, I mean, on what we've been hearing from housing associations who use our support tools, that moving accommodation outside local authorities is causing them a huge amount of difficulty. Because if they're people who are applying for mutual exchanges or applying for one of their properties, they're having to do an individual assessment of absolutely everybody who's applying to make sure that they're not moving to universal credit and will lose out. Now, of course, some will move to universal credit and gain, but they're having to do a reassessment and then re-advise people about, actually, let's now look at the affordability and your new income. So they have ended up not offering properties to people because of this change, because it's across a borough border.
What should we recommend, Zoe?
I think the move between local authorities is one that could just wait for managed migration, really, because it is actually causing the need for individual assessments on the ground. And then you have the unfairness of those people who can have the individual assessments and those people who can't. So some people have access, particularly housing association tenants, to that support. Other people haven't got that sort of access. And it seems to be one of those ones that is certainly causing the majority of problems.
David and then Tom, how do you think we should deal with this?
And do you agree that those are the categories that seem most unreasonable?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a general problem that for some people, the change in circumstances that means they need to claim a different benefit is potentially going to be because of either an adverse life event or something that is maybe adding pressure on their income, so they're having a child thing. But I think certainly, I think we've already talked about the ones being mostly made worse off are these kind of younger parents. So potentially you can remove that just by restoring parity back to the older parents, or with the kind of the standard allowances. And I think then the other big one, which I think is also the one that really is the issue of parity with people who will be on the managed migration and getting the transitional protection, is something like the local authority area move. But I'm not sure how, I don't think you're necessarily saying this, but I don't know how you can stop people from moving house until they get to the managed migration thing. So it's a kind of, I suppose, ultimately you need some kind of easement to
We'll come on in a minute to what you think we need to do to better protect those people that are going to actually migrate across. It's just whether there are any stop gaps that you can immediately think of.
And I think the other big thing is it's not just the kind of income changes, but the conditionality being changed as well. So when you move on to universal credit, you'll have there's the stricter conditionality on single parents because they've reduced the age of child at which the conditionality will start to apply. And also
it's a different world, universal credit, isn't it, in terms of your behaviour and your obligations.
And bringing in the second earners and a couple into the conditionality agreements as well. I think that's almost, even if there's no income change, you've got to get used to the new benefits as well.
Okay.
Tom?
Yes, I think the way I kind of understand what the DWP are trying to do with this approach is they basically want to say, now that you see full service is active everywhere, we don't want any new claims to legacy benefits. And I suppose there might be some administrative reason why it's difficult for them to, in an area that's on UC full service, to go and open up a JSA claim or whatever. But that said, they do have some exceptions to natural migration where you can do something that would normally naturally migrate you, but they do actually open up a new legacy benefit claim. And so it must be possible for them to do it in some sense. But I think it strikes me that's the key question, is around the administration of how easy it is for them to open up new legacy benefit claims when the area.
What are the reasons why they would do that currently?
What the exceptions? If you're moving to supported housing, and there might be one more. I think that's the main one.
Okay.
But this rule was thought up, wasn't it, to trigger and push people onto universal credit. If the Secretary of State is really keen on having a sample of 20,000 and learning the lessons before managed migration starts, that's an argument to all migration, isn't it?
To do all migration as managed migration.
Yes.
Is that what you mean? I mean, that would be an option open to the government. I'm not sure how.
We would then know how things would work from that 20,000 sample, and then whether she was happy with it, and what changes she would make.
Yeah, so I suppose the question is about how administratively easy it is for them to open up a housing benefit claim, say, in an area which has fully switched over to UC. I don't know what the answer to that is.
No, but we're talking about people already on benefit, aren't we? We could say for all those that there's a freeze on everybody except the 20,000 that are going to be the guinea pigs, which we're going to learn from for future policy. But anybody who's not claiming any benefit now would go onto universal credit straight away. Yeah, so yes, and natural migration happens when you're already on some legacy benefit, but you start claiming a new one, and that's where that obviously requires, I guess, it requires opening up a new claim in the housing benefit system or in the tax credit system or whatever, and whether or not how administratively feasible or challenging that is, I guess, kind of the key question for DWP. If that's straightforward for them to do, then they could do exactly as you describe.
Zoe, a quick question to you. Are there any circumstances you can think of where that trigger, that change in circumstance, is different for naturally migrated people as opposed to managed migrated people? Or does everybody get treated the same, child of 5, etc., etc.? What would kick you off your transitionally protected managed migration? Would it be the same as natural migration?
No, it's very, very closely drawn. What would kick you off your transitional protection is a sustained drop in income for more than 3 months, formation or separation of a couple, or termination of your UC award. But there's some provision in there for if it's under 4 months, and you can go back onto it. So your ages of children, and all those conditionality things that change benefits in the legacy system are not being brought into universal credit. So
the natural it is tougher.
It's much tougher on the people who are naturally migration. Yeah, and as I think, just as Frank says, to get the move of people over quickly. Yeah. And I think that even though that is having that, if that was the intention, that's what's happening. Yes. But there are some individual circumstances where actually that test and learn approach should be learning. Where people are suffering because of the natural migration. I know that's coming on to the second part, but in particular the people with ESA who have failed work capability assessments, and so they're they then have a choice. If they can either claim universal credit if they're putting in an appeal and get some money, or they can live on nothing, hope they get an appeal and then they're allowed to get back onto ESA. So
but
actually,
only if they don't claim.
Yes.
They literally have to live without nothing.
They have to live with nothing. So actually, again, this comes down to an individual assessment. They have to weigh up how likely they are to win that appeal. This is putting an awful lot on all people. They have to make a sort of bet with themselves, really, on which way it's going to go. So if there are unintentional consequences of this swift move over to universal credit, I think that that's where the test and learn comes in.
And that is the entire point of this session, to understand how unacceptable it is, the choices for people who are going to be naturally migrated across, which of course now has been exacerbated by that it's been delayed by a year. Yeah. On the one hand, of course, we were delighted that the SI was pulled apart and required only these 10,000 claimants to be put through. But just talk to all of us, if you may, perhaps again start with Zoe and move down the line. This is huge, isn't it? If more people will naturally migrate across because we've got this extra year, I think we've already covered how difficult and unacceptable it will be for a lot of people financially. But what's the answer? What should government be doing?
I think that there could be a lot more individual choice. I mean, if you look at the triggers for moving to universal credit, an awful lot of them come down to the person's choice. Which would you prefer, universal credit or... And obviously that'll come down to if they're better off, they're likely to go for universal credit, and if they've got the money for the wait. But there could be an awful lot more individual choice on this until we get to managed migration, just to ensure cases such as this one on ESA don't occur. And maybe not for everybody if that becomes too cumbersome. I understand that there is going to be anything where you get to individual choice, you're looking at individual assessments.
Who would do that piece of work? Because Citizens Advice, their contract is only once you're on it. How...
I'm not sure. You would have to increase frontline advice, and that's where it falls down. That you have got those frontline advisors within local authorities, housing associations, but they're not. There's probably not enough to allow everybody to have an individual assessment.
Because your contact with a work coach is after you've applied, isn't it? It's not before.
Yeah, absolutely. And people would have to make an assessment themselves, which is an awful lot to ask of people.
Well, impossible for most.
But I think that if you don't have a choice, because the cohorts, if you look at the cohorts who lose, they aren't absolute. That even within self-employed, some people who are the better off self-employed will be better off under universal credit. You could actually, by stopping natural migration, or you could actually be making some people actually worse off earlier on.
Yeah.
So has anybody done any analysis, I'm possibly looking at you, David, but maybe not, about the difference in costs between providing all that hand-holding and keeping legacy benefit systems going for a bit longer, if that's what that turns out to be the best route for that particular person, versus the government just providing transitional protection for everybody that is being naturally migrated across? Do we have any feel for what would cost more? Or
No, for sure. But I mean, I think there is a thing as well that that advice would be almost like, I think there could well be circumstances where if you've based it all on what you think a person's current circumstances are, and then their circumstances change a month or two later, they find themselves not having made the right decision. So I think it's very hard to actually have full, proper advice because people don't know what's going to happen to them, so they can't possibly understand what all the consequences are and the risks around them. So I think like some clearer advice would help. I mean, one option I think is you could move into slowing down the natural migration in some way. So if you were really looking for parity, you could apply the rules that apply for ending sort of transitional protection to people and the natural migration. So you're picking up much bigger changes in circumstances, so things like becoming unemployed and the formation and separation of a couple. But then I think you do, with the couple formation thing, you do run into this problem of potentially that's a time of stress and difficulty, and so keeping that as a main trigger could be a problem. But potentially it's a thing of isolating those changes that are going to cause either a financial penalty or that are kind of a stressful occurrence for some people, and targeting support at them to help kind of ease through if you were going to keep the current kind of natural migration rules.
Any ideas for you, Tom, finally?
Yeah, so slowing down natural migration in some way will require opening up new legacy benefit claims if people are going to stay on legacy benefits. I suppose the other major option is you do move people across to UC at the point they're naturally migrated, but you also give them transitional protection just as those.
Guarantee them what they had.
Yeah. I suppose the one kind of thing I would say about that is presumably the purpose of transitional protection isn't to protect people from seeing the effects of UC forever, but is to stop them having an overnight change in their income. Yeah. Whereas typically when the things that cause you to be naturally migrated will cause you to have a change in your income anyway, and so giving them transitional protection doesn't actually necessarily stop that. But that would be a way of kind of continuing the natural migration rollout of UC, but
it's parity with managed migration at least, isn't it? If you apply that transitional protection.
Yeah, it would treat them the same.
I think
very good. Sorry, David?
Can I just add, the transitional protection thing, when you look at the churn involved in the OBR figures, it is quite high, so it's not lasting, for some people, especially the working families, it's not going to last that long. And I actually think the way it's estimated, it probably only actually gives you what you'd have had in the tax credit system for the first month that you get it, because after that the taper starts to apply to your UC awards. So then there's none of the kind of disregard you'd get in the tax credit system. And things like the payments and periodicity problems of being paid 4 weekly and then you get 2 payments in a month all start to apply as well, rather than having an averaged income. So I think the idea that people will have this kind of constant income compared to what they had in the tax credit system for 6 months or a year or something is not really there. I think it starts to vary almost from month 2 basically. So it's not all encompassing protection. I think it's quite transitory.
Okay. Thank you very much. We now understand why Amber Rudd is taking her time. Very good. God, it's complicated, isn't it?
So next panel?
Yeah, sorry. I was thanking you with that comment.
We're done with you.
Yes.
On your treasure question deadline.
The proceeding is currently suspended.
The last session. Daphne, would you like to begin to introduce yourself, and we will then begin?
Yeah, my name is Daphne Hall. I'm the Vice Chair of the National Association of Welfare Rights Advisors, and I also work for RightsNet, which is a social welfare law website where we have a lot of discussion forums which also highlight a lot of the issues going on.
James Taylor, Head of Policy Campaigns at Scope, the disability charity.
Kayley, Hignell, Head of Policy for Families, Welfare and Work at Citizens Advice.
Do you think it's possible to take that bottle away in front of that mic? And Heidi, do you mind? Because your voice is quite gentle. Do you think you might move that mic along?
There we go.
Yes.
Shall I move it along?
Could you do that again for us?
Oh.
It's quite heavy.
It's quite heavy, yeah.
I know.
Thank
don't allow
you.
people to knock the mics over
I'll try and speak up as well.
Yeah, please do. Thank you.
Thanks.
And I'm Kelly Marie Jones from Child Poverty Action Group. I manage the early warning system which collates a database of cases which highlight the effects of welfare reform in England and Wales.
Brilliant. Nigel?
So to go back to a theme we had in the previous panel, do any of you have any views on which groups lose out the most if they transfer to UC from legacy benefits and what the impact of these losses are? Daphne, go on, you can start.
I'm happy to begin. I've got a long list. I think some of them probably did come up before. I think one of the most sort of heartbreaking ones we've seen are people who've been recently bereaved, and so they've had to be pushed onto universal credit because of bereavement. Obviously a very traumatic time in their lives. One of the really nasty impacts is if someone dies and the bedroom tax becomes an issue because they've died. If you stay on housing benefit, you're protected for 12 months, but that doesn't carry through on universal credit. So we've seen clients where they've been bereaved, suddenly they've got an extra room, and not only they had to move on to universal credit, they've also found that they've been hit by the bedroom tax at a very difficult time. There also seems to be an issue with universal credit actually applying the regulations correctly, where there's a run-on of carers allowance and giving the extra carer a bit for 8 weeks. And in law, I believe that should be happening, but it's not happening. So that's a group, I mean, perhaps a smaller group, but a group that's hit really, really hard. I know others, I'll perhaps focus on a couple. And the other one I was going to say was the EA Nationals, because the decision-making has been very, very poor for EA Nationals, and they're not looking at the past histories, and there's no access to advance payments or anything. So if an EA National applies and then has to wait ages for a decision, they've got absolutely no resources at all. So I think those two groups stand out, but I'm sure you'll have others. I'll let others go.
Well, I think we heard from the previous session that disabled people are one of the groups who are potentially at risk at losing out the most from natural migration. And I think this is on top of the fact that disabled people, purely by their impairment or condition, face extra costs anyway. The major reason we think at Scope is that many disabled people could lose their disability premiums if it's not the severe disability premium under moving to universal credit. And I think that becomes worse as they will receive no transitional protection whatsoever. So, for example, a claimant in receipt currently of enhanced disability premium, if they move on to universal credit, could see a decrease of around £200, about £195 a month if they don't receive transitional protection. So disabled people are a group of people who potentially lose out the most.
I would echo what's been said already. There is a kind of theme basically of the people who lose out in universal credit now are people who had some kind of tailoring in the system to recognise what could be quite unusual circumstances, but circumstances that really demanded that extra support. So people moving on to universal credit who have a disabled child, for example, depending on the rate of the benefit that they're eligible for, can find that they get half the support that they did get before. As mentioned with disabled people, we have permitted work rules in universal credit, and again you can see that in the current system permitted work rules gave you a work allowance of around £6,526, or specifically that, whereas it comes down to more like 3,500 in universal credit. So big losses for very specific groups, but it is a choice around simplicity and tailoring at the moment, and what we're seeing is the people who are losing out are those who need that extra support. We need a benefit system that can provide those bits of extra support for all circumstances.
Kayley Marie?
We've seen cases of all of those scenarios in our early warning system where people have become worse off on universal credit. You've already heard about young people, particularly young parents, being worse off because they're not getting the higher rate of the standard allowance. So those are people who lose out due to not having the equivalent premiums or elements in universal credit that they would have had in legacy benefits. But there are other losers as well. There's a particular problem with the lack of universal credit backdating because there's a maximum of 1 month backdate and only in particular circumstances, where legacy benefit rules are more generous, up to 3 months backdating and for a good reason, which can cover a myriad of circumstances. So people who delay in claiming for any reason, so that could be temporary health concerns, so people who have cancer scare, for example, may not necessarily be counted as having disability, but they weren't able to manage their benefit claims at that time. Family bereavement, child protection concerns, waiting for an advisor appointment. That was a common reason for people getting a backdate in legacy benefits, but that's not a reason for a backdate in universal credit, which is of concern because due to austerity cuts, there's not been as much support available for people to start a benefit claim if they don't know how to do it themselves. So they're going to delay making that claim with a new system that they don't understand, and then they're not going to be able to access the back date that they would have been able to in legacy benefits. We're also seeing people who are worse off due to administrative problems, purely just purely administrative issues. Daphne's already mentioned the problem with the carer element, which we are addressing with DWP separately. We're also seeing people missing elements in their universal credit which they should have from the start of their claim. And one of particular concern is real-time information errors, where their earnings are being reported by HMRC to DWP, but those figures are incorrect. That's resulting in universal credit claimants not getting as much or any entitlement that they should be for the months it takes for the DWP to rectify that discrepancy with HMRC. So that's not necessarily a specific group that you can point to, because it could affect anyone who has earnings when they transfer to universal credit.
Nigel?
Could I just add self-employment as well? Because just when you say the self-employed, it's very punitive moving over to universal credit.
So. No, thank you.
So you've given us quite a long list to build on the already long list we had. I mean, are there any easy fixes that you could recommend that would take out some of these problems as an alternative to just not transferring people? Is there anything you can say, God, that should be so simple to do, why don't we just do that and help these people?
I mean, it was mentioned earlier, but in terms of currently, we have added extra gateways to universal credit to stop people moving over to universal credit where they face particular losses and arguably particular problems with the claims process as well. With the welcome change around the severe disability premium, so people getting that benefit now won't be moving on to it. Arguably, that creates an opportunity to look a bit more broader and go, well, what other situations exist where we know specific groups face particular losses or face particular problems with the process. So we do think, and we have asked government to look at whether that can be broadened out. That would slow down natural migration as well, which we're still looking at 1.6 million people this year. All of those people don't get transitional protection. They are going through a change in their life, a change of circumstances that can be hard. And just generally, there's no fixes on the horizon for the known problems with universal credit, so we would recommend something along those lines. We would also recommend stopping people from moving on to universal credit if they are in the middle of an appeal. Or mandatory reconsideration is the first stage of that. That's a hugely complex situation to know whether people are eligible or not for universal credit, whether they're better off or not. And nobody knows, as was mentioned earlier, nobody knows the outcome of that appeal. So it's putting people between a rock and a hard place in terms of short-term finances versus long-term lower finances. So those two, I think, could be done. How would you handle that recommendation, Kayley? Because presumably I submit a mandatory reconsideration which gets rejected, as they generally seem to. Yep. And then there's a window in which I can be moved to UC before I get to appeal the decision that is in the post to me. I mean, are you saying there should be kind of like a period of, once you've done the mandatory reconsideration, you get a slot to appeal and there's a
sort of a block for 3 months or something?
It's during the mandatory reconsideration that the problem happens, because at that you are not eligible for any benefit income unless you change to claim job seekers allowance, and the trigger then to claim job seekers allowance prompts the universal credit claim. The amount that you would get, for example, in ESA on the assessment phase of ESA is the same as what you would be getting in JSA. So from our point of view, there is an argument to say that people just stay on the assessment phase whilst they're going through mandatory reconsideration, and that therefore doesn't trigger this need to consider a JSA claim or what in effect is a UC claim. So it's a change in ESA rather than a change in UC to try and help with that situation.
But Nigel, can I just ask, Nigel before has given the idea that the department should be proactive, that if you're on benefits, it's they that should do the migration over to universal credit. Now, if they were actually doing that, they could actually present to people, you are better off, quickly claim.
Yeah,
and we've actually got the claim ready for you, couldn't they?
Even in natural migration, if you think about it, the claimant journey, the person's journey, starts when they have the change of circumstance. So even if you don't fully move to a fully managed migration system, which is actual managed migration, moving somebody over, you've got lots of opportunities at the ending of the other awards, say tax credits, to talk to people about what's going on, what they should expect, whether they're going to be better off or worse off as well. And all of those touch points are happening for that individual. It's not just when they have that first call to UC or first online experience with it. So from our point of view, you need to look at the journey from the change of circumstance. Whether that is automating claims over or not, it should be considered as part of the communications that go out to people.
No, can I just develop, because there's a possibility for a recommendation. Nigel's view was, am I right, Nigel, that you could well speak for yourself, that when you're going to be migrated, the department has the information on your benefit status, and they could use that, maybe with a bit of supplementary evidence from you, to undertake your universal credit claim.
Yeah.
Now, in those circumstances where people feel frightened, don't want to be moved over, going for mandatory reconsideration, then appeal, the department could cut a lot of that out, couldn't they? If they actually sent a letter to you to say, don't worry, you're going to be better off.
Yeah, I mean, and as long as it's right is the challenge as well. I should say, like, what we tend to see, not necessarily that common, is misadvice around extra eligibility or being better off or the like from one of the government departments involved in terms of not fully understanding the implications of universal credit for somebody's change of circumstance. But yeah, in reporting a change of circumstance, you're reporting information that could be used to then help people onto that claim for universal credit, either automatically or not.
Nigel, back to you.
Just to go back to where I was, Kate, because I think what you were proposing was that somebody who loses their ESA should not be forced to move on to UC while they're having a mandatory reconsideration. My question was, the problem is there are various gaps in the timeline then, because I get turned down for ESA, there's a gap before I make my mandatory reconsideration, and then I get that rejected, or hopefully not, and then there's a gap before I trigger my appeal, because I have to do a process. Is what you're suggesting that once you've been turned down for ESA, there should be a 3-month period where you can stay on it until you've decided whether to appeal or not, or mandatory, or are you just trying to us to recommend that literally during the 2 weeks you're having a mandatory reconsideration before they reject it, you shouldn't be forced to move? I mean, that was...
Yeah, I mean, you could do it as a 3-month, you could do it as whilst you're going through this process, but fundamentally, the thing that you're appealing on ESA is the extra component in ESA, not the assessment phase, because that isn't different to the other benefits, or in effect to UC. So we have a baseline eligibility there for somebody, and it's the process that's getting in the way from stopping them from having that income, or forcing difficult decisions around universal credit. So either way, either a 3-month period or once you're going through these stages, that you should remain eligible for at least the assessment phase.
Can I pick up on something that Kayley said at the beginning, that you could extend the gateway, because at the moment we have this SDP gateway, which in some ways is extremely hard to understand, because a lot of claimants don't know they have an SDP, because it isn't to benefit an SDP, it's just a tool to calculate how much benefit you get. So it causes a lot of confusion. There could be an argument for saying if there's any PIP, DLA in the household, that should be the gateway. One, it's clearer for people to know, And it would also pick up a lot of the other people that lose on migration to universal credit, such as those with disabled children, disabled workers. All of those lose because there isn't recognition of disability in universal credit, as James was saying. If you just said any DLA or PIP in the household, that's the gateway. Much simpler to manage, and would pick up a lot more people who are going to lose out without, because they don't get transitional protection, because, as you said, disabled people are one of the key losers.
Nigel, are you happy? Derek?
Yeah, thanks. You kind of answered the question in the sense that I think you said, Kayley, about 1.6 million that will be, I think, natural migration before the transition arrangements are in place. And you've already all of you hinted that the circumstances are not reasonable, not in every case. That actually, so you talk about bereavement, actually it's just harsh to impose that on someone, particularly if it's not done quickly, they lose out. So how, if the obvious intention is to get everyone on universal credit at some point, 1.6 million, if that could be done and done fairly and properly, is actually not necessarily a negative if we're moving towards, if the intention is to go on to universal credit. So it's kind of, if everything was fine, it would be not an, it would be, I'm going to use the word success, but success in the sense of process. So how do you then, can you add more to, in terms of how any one of you, how you can begin to look at what's reasonable and what's not reasonable, and how can it be made reasonable and fair and sympathetic and compassionate and all the things that you would hope welfare would do? I mean, I don't know who tackles that. Just so we can start looking at some of these examples of these circumstances and saying, well, actually, that is just clearly not the intention. No one sat at a desk and said, this is what we are going to do to you. How can we make it fair and reasonable?
May I start? I think,
sure, yeah, James.
As we just heard from Daphne, there is no disability element within universal credit as there is in the legacy system. And whilst it's really welcome that transitional protection is now provided to people who get severe disability premiums, that doesn't extend to disability premiums and enhanced disability premiums. And there's around 1 million people who use those at the moment. And we want to see that transitional protection, which government introduced last month, extended to those two groups of people as well, which they will get through managed migration. But as we've heard, if they trigger a change of circumstances, they will lose out and won't get as much as they have been getting at the moment.
I think it's worth highlighting that's exactly what the court said as well in the TP case, was that it's discriminatory not to give protection on natural migration. And all right, that was only looking at the SDP, but I know Child Poverty Action Group have just had another case with a disabled child, similar, exactly the same kind of loss, but because their child lost their DLA, which they later got back, and lost was about £170 a month as a result. So the courts are saying, we haven't got the result of that case yet, but hopefully they will, but the courts are saying it's discriminatory not to give that transitional protection. So the government should listen to what the court is saying and therefore apply the transitional protection in natural migration.
So as you, obviously, I know that some still want to speak, but just to kind of clarify, of the 1.6 million, was that the figure you used during this year? Presumably that won't all be negative. That would, some of them that do natural migration, that will just be. So have you any idea of how the proportions of that, of the ones that are unreasonable? How can we focus on those and try and get that right? Is there any way of doing that?
I mean, you'd have to look at data about what types of changes of circumstances are triggered, and that's the difficulty with universal credit. And just more broadly, rather than like thinking about specific instances, our benefit system has to be there to help people through crisis in their life. But what we've seen with the design of natural migration is that crisis triggers more pressure and more support and less support, arguably, in these situations. So there just needs to be more acknowledgement that our benefit system is there for that purpose amongst many other purposes. So even if that is looking at what happens in universal credit, so you straight away get conditionality, can there be breaks in that? You straight away don't have the transitional protection, so face that loss through natural migration. You straight away have a 5-week wait, like even with advanced payments, people are still struggling. So all of those things are front-ended in the design of this natural migration process.
So would your suggestion simply be then that all those where we could identify the unreasonable, so the bereavements and the other circumstances which you have no control over, they just come upon you, and actually it's a disaster for you because you haven't got the transitional arrangements, that we just pause all of those, the natural migration, the others, fine, pause all those until transition arrangements are in place. Is that really what is the way forward?
It would be great if they could do that. I mean, as you were just saying, natural migration is quite likely to come at a stressful time. Maybe you're separating from a violent relationship, bereavement we've already said, moving, child losing their DLA. All of those are very stressful in themselves and often have extra costs that go alongside them. And then suddenly, all the things that Kayley's just said, it's just too much for people.
But so I do accept that, but some natural migration might be.
Some might be fine. Yeah, if you've just got somebody going in and out of work, they're fit, they're healthy, they're perhaps on 0 hours contracts, sometimes they've got more money, sometimes they've got less, so they're moving between what might be JSA and tax credits. Yeah, for those people, actually universal credit can work better. Yeah. But it's the vulnerable people that need the support, and they're just not getting it, and it's causing just unbelievable hardship.
We would be wary of extending gateways in a way that isn't simplistic, because the way that gateways have worked so far hasn't been 100% successful. Previously we had the 2-child gateway because we were waiting for the 2-child limit to be sorted out with universal credit. But we still had families with 3, 4, 5 children getting onto universal credit when they shouldn't have. We're yet to see how a severe disability premium gateway works in practice, because we don't know if claimants are going to know if they've got the premium. They might only be getting it in the housing benefit, so do the DWP know that? People who would have got it if their PIP claim was decided promptly, but actually universal credit starts before the result of that claim comes through. So extending the gateway more to add more and more categories might just cause more problems and more of these gaps for people, and we won't know until it's too late. If you're going to introduce gateway, it has to be a fairly across-the-board, straightforward process that anyone can understand.
That's helpful, thanks. I've finished, thanks, Chair.
Thank you. Rosie?
We've got some instances that have been highlighted by Daphne's organisation, the National Association of Welfare Advisors, where job centres have been sort of herding people through onto universal credit from JSA. And I just wondered if you could expand about that. And also CPAG have highlighted the fact that job centres are also doing that from ESA to UC. Do you know more about that? How much are we talking?
It's come up through the RightsNet discussion thread, and various different bits of the country. In fact, I noted a few of them down with Bridport, Stockton, Renfrewshire and Middlesbrough have all reported that. Similar practice, that just at the job centre been told, it's a good idea to move over to universal credit. One of them even drawn a handy little flow chart for their client on how to do it. No change of circumstance at all, just wait for your next JSA payment, cancel your JSA claim universal credit. And just this will make it easier for you. And no proper advice, and no disrespect to people in the job centre, but they're not benefits advisors, they're employment support people. They don't have a fully understanding. And there can all be all sorts of things behind the scenes that, they might be better off, but they could easily be worse off, and the work coach won't necessarily know that. And they're moving, and once they've moved.
Do we know why? Why has that been triggered? Just because they think, this sounds like a good idea?
I could only hope, being nice to them, they are thinking it's a good idea, it would be better for people. I'm sure they're not doing it through, but I hope they're not doing it through to try and make things worse, that they think, this will be easier if you do it now. Yeah. But it's terrible advice. They should, as someone was saying earlier, they should be getting proper advice, and that's the thing, I think you need people in the job centres, proper benefits advisors, welfare rights advisors, who can give a holistic look. Are you better off, worse off? What are the financial implications? What are the other implications like conditionality? And to give people proper choices before anything happens.
And presumably you guys have to pick the pieces up when that goes horribly wrong and re-advise them and try and do an appeal.
Yeah, so similarly we're seeing like a handful, we're not seeing like a structure to this, if that makes sense, across all of the data coming across from our bureau, but definitely seeing these cases coming in where there seems to have been some advice to say you'll be better off and why don't you do this. I think the challenge with universal credit is once you're in it there's no way out as well, and people can be worse off as a result of that advice, and again there's no system there to compensate or to make sure that people aren't worse off because of poor advice given by Job Centre, HMRC, local authorities, whoever it is in that instance. And again, with the SDP change here, with the gateway adding, we also have the bit where for severe disability premium, where people have lost out on that, they're being compensated for that. We do think that gives the opportunity to the government to look again at what counts in terms of those compensation situations. If somebody has moved over in that situation and is worse off, they should be getting something to recognise that difference in benefit.
Yeah, I mean, if there's no way back, presumably, how do they make up that shortfall? There's no straightforward way of doing that.
And as we can see it, like we're taking cases through along this and putting complaints in and the like, but the SDP one is the only one that has been formally recognised to say that that is a requirement to put that compensation in place. There's also a question on how long that compensation lasts and in what situations it applies, like did you make a claim at this point or this point? There's a lot of complexity around it. But either way, fundamentally there is a problem that there is no system in place for when that happens to either get people out of UC back to where they would have been better off or to recognise it in the UC award.
Rosie, could we just pause? Sorry, could we pause? Steve, you want to come on that point?
Yeah, I just wanted to ask, I think it's the National Association of Welfare Rights Advisors who say that people should be allowed to return if they were poorly advised and they end up worse off. Shouldn't it be a case that there should be an automatic right to return if you've actually been put in that predicament?
It's exactly the point I was just going to say. Within the SDP gateway regulations, there is provision to take somebody back if they've accidentally migrated over, despite having an SDP. They've built in the provision to send them back. Therefore, they can do it. So our argument is if someone's been misadvised and claimed universal credit when they didn't have to, then those same provisions should be put in place for them.
So there doesn't appear to be a technical impediment.
No, if the DWP can do it for the SDP, they can do it for everyone.
Well, maybe we should be looking at that, Chair.
Indeed, I think it's really good. We've got a recommendation. Back to Rosie.
Sorry, I was just thinking, doesn't that kind of make a bit of a mockery of the appeals process in the first place? If they can't actually go backwards, it's Pandora's box, isn't it? You can't go back and do something about it, even though it's not your own fault, or even necessarily the advisor if they're confused.
Yeah.
So
these are kind of long-standing traditions or purposes within the benefit system that have stood for some time through different variants of, IB, ESA, PIP, DLA, and isn't necessarily in this case available. So it is a challenge basically that needs to be addressed.
I think just on building what Kayley said about STP and compensation, that's really welcome. But we've heard from some people that compensation might come too late, and some are making a choice between heating and eating, and where do they put their limited funds while they wait for that compensation. We also hear from our helpline that people who have moved in the same local authority area and are on ESA are being told they need to move on to universal credit when that isn't the case, and that is causing some confusion amongst people that we support at Scope 2.
We're seeing this issue arise not just in job centres but also local authorities, where people are being advised to claim universal credit before they actually need to. I've forgotten my point now. So we've been talking about the SDP compensation and being able to go back to universal credit then, but presumably that's when the job centre has mistakenly put them onto...
No, the regulations provide that if you get moved over when there was an SDP in place, that you can go back, they will cancel the DWP benefits and then instruct the housing benefit to reinstate housing benefit.
So that kind of provision would still work if it was a local authority who had inadequately advised.
Yeah.
Chris?
Yeah, thanks. This is Chris with Kayley. Citizens Advice, I've received a contract from the government in relation to providing universal support. So it's just to ask, how will your organisation be able to help claimants understand the implications of moving from the legacy benefit to universal credit as part of that provision?
So we have received a grant to provide universal support. That grant covers help to make a claim and up to getting your first full payment of universal credit. So all of the stages involved there and the different pieces of advice that you might need along that process. As part of that, we are able to check whether somebody has to claim universal credit. As we say, there are some situations where actually there is no other option. That is the benefit to claim. And then also if there are situations where people have a choice, to make sure they get told that it is a choice and the implications on either side of it. If somebody needs a fuller benefit check, then we would refer and signpost into either our normal services or into other organisations as they exist. But as was mentioned, there's a lot of pressure on those services as well. So our service will help people to check whether it's a choice or a necessity, and if it is a choice, the different implications for whichever option they take. So we are hoping to help to avoid some of this kind of misrouting, if that makes sense, through this. It's in pilot stages at the moment, so we're learning a lot in that process about what works, what doesn't, what type of advice is needed, demand and those kind of things. We're not quite at a sample size yet on that to know fully, but we're starting to see people coming through it and testing the design of it. It is still a limited support offer, and we should be really clear about that. It doesn't cover debt advice, it doesn't cover ongoing support. We're not funded to provide support for people going through managed migration as well. So those things aren't included in universal support help to claim.
Would you like it to be?
Yeah, I mean, there's definite demand for that. Our evidence on debt is quite clear, for example, that universal credit claimants that we see are much more likely to have debt than people who have legacy claims. And then when we look at the type of debt that they have, they're more likely to have priority debt, so rent, council tax and the like. So to us, whether it's the change of circumstance that's bringing them into universal credit, whether it's the 5-week wait and advance payments and all of those elements of universal credit that can add on to it, that person is struggling with debt at that point in their life and therefore needs debt advice. So for us, it's get people some money coming in through universal support help to claim, and then we think these other needs are there. On ongoing support, to be clear as well, we want to push the government to give us some much more, and I say us, all advice organisations, much more clarity on how you access universal credit on a non-digital channel. There is that availability, but we're not clear how to use it and what it offers. So is it text messages and SMS and the like? But either way, there's a group of people who will need some hand-holding throughout the process of universal credit, and that's not built in.
Chris, could Neil come in and then back to you? Thanks, Neil.
And we may discuss this, but how do the claimants know that you're there to support them? How are they finding you? Have DWP included you on the letters yet?
Yes, so I mean, we're already on DWP's letters largely, including tax credits and local authorities as a source of advice. Universal support help to claim has a no wrong door kind of aspect to it, which means that you can self-present, that you can be referred from any other organisation, and that we have the existing referral routes from job centres, local authorities and the like. We will also be promoting the service locally, testing where works for that, and certainly from the 1st of April, when that service becomes nationwide, we'll be able to do a bit more of that promotion at that point. So yeah, making sure people know it exists is really crucial to us.
So Kayley, what options are available then to claimants to help them mitigate the impact of any loss of income?
This is a really interesting question. I don't think really for many people there is that much mitigation. We're on the back of many years of reductions in the value of benefits. We've got the benefit freeze, we have things that like sanctions and the like in the system as well. So add all of that up, even if you can mitigate slightly with something like local welfare assistance or a discretionary housing payment. One, they're temporary, and two, to be honest, for the losses that lots of people are facing, they're just not enough. So from our point of view, much more attention needs to be given to the value of benefits. We do want the benefit freeze lifted early. We do want to look again at the losses, particularly for disabled people within universal credit. And changes to local housing allowance particularly drive loss of income as well. I do think there is on mitigations. The only thing that would be helpful is removing like penalties like sanctions, reducing deductions, for example, where they all add on to that experience that people face. So again, thinking about people moving on to universal credit at a point in their life where they're going through a stressful process, all of that hits in one go. Your tax credit overpayments being recovered, your AP, your advance payments being recovered, you potentially face a sanction because you've not got on with the online system. All of that is happening at a point where people are stressed anyway and struggling anyway. So there is an argument to look at when those things start coming into the process for universal credit as well.
Ruth, before
Thank
Steve.
You. People, when they're renewing their existing tax credit claim, which for most people will be coming up in the next few months or so, are going to be given a choice between remaining on tax credits or claiming universal credit. Is there the capacity within advice services to cope with these around 6 million tax credit claimants at the moment who are going to be given that choice to make sure at pretty much the same point in time they'll probably have round about 28 days in order to make that decision and reclaim tax credits or claim universal credit. How are we going to make sure that those millions of people don't erroneously claim universal credit?
With a huge difficulty, that's an impossible task. That's news to me, Ruth. I didn't know that those were going out. I think that's so dangerous because so many people on tax credit, it's going to be such a shock to their systems. They've just been on tax credits. They're self-employed, we've already said, but people who maybe aren't working, getting the 35 hours at the minimum wage, would suddenly have conditionality put on them, with a whole new thing for them. They've been, perhaps going along quite happily, supporting their families, working, and then suddenly there's all these other expectations put on them. And so many people could end up on universal credit in a way worse position. And a lot of them may just not even try to seek advice. They might just think, oh, I'll do it. And if they if they actually have savings over 16,000, there's no entitlement to universal credit at all. So if they've got like a small nest egg somehow or something like that, or they've got a house they rent out but actually doesn't bring any money, they could suddenly find that they've lost all entitlement and can never get it back. And there's certainly been the odd case like that already, hasn't there?
That is a concern because currently there are online benefits. I'm thinking about people who can manage an online universal credit claim. So if they get that letter, okay, I'll go online and start claiming universal credit. There's nowhere in the universal credit claim process where you can check your entitlement before you start the claim process. It just goes straight to starting the claim. And it seems like a fairly easy fix to put digital calculators at the start of that process, or actually the option of seeing what you could get, to see if you'll be better off.
Do those digital calculators work? Because I've had various people saying that they don't seem to work for them, and obviously the advice you get is only as good as the information you put in.
This is another concern, that there isn't, on the gov.uk website, there is not a benefit calculator provided by the department. They rely on third parties to provide that. So there's 3 recommended benefit calculators, and those 3 calculators will give 3 different results, and they'll all argue about how theirs is the most correct. So again, that's another issue. So even if they do check, they can't necessarily trust the result.
And things like self-employed, where it's a monthly thing, those calculators don't take into account like somebody who might earn the minimum wage over the entire year, and therefore you'd argue shouldn't have their minimum income applied. If their variable income means that some months they don't make the minimum wage, they'll lose out on those months, even though they might be earning over the course of the year the minimum wage. And the calculators look at things like that, when your yearly income.
Different things. So I think the policy and practice one allows you to check what you would get month by month.
Does it? Right. Okay.
Whereas the turn to us would do an annual. So you don't know which one is best to use, because of course no one calculator can calculate all of those scenarios.
I think worth bearing in mind also that there are plenty of people in this country who are digitally excluded, and 1 in 5 disabled people don't or can't have access to the internet, so can't use those calculators even if they were correct in the first place.
Yes. So you think the government should be very, very careful with the advice that it gives to people who are renewing their tax credit claims as to whether they're
there needs to be a big warning sign. You must get advice first. I know the government likes to say that everyone's a winner on universal credit, but it's just not true. Yeah. And if you've got disabled workers, they're going to be big losers coming over. And there needs to be a warning. You should get advice with where you can get the advice before you make the decision to do it. A huge, big warning sign.
And just to flag as well, like that kind of situation is something where all of those people would need advice or assistance to know whether they are better off on universal credit or not, and potentially information around things like income changes disregards that exist in tax credits and don't exist in universal credit. So again, that fluctuating income, potentially you're better off in universal credit because of that. Universal support is not there to help everybody and is not resourced or funded to help everybody within it, and it's a difficult thing around how do you project demand for this, but it's not set up in a way that projects demand that goes everybody on tax credits is going to need some assistance at this point in time, with that idea of should they claim universal credit, do they need to claim universal credit. So the demand is not projected on the basis of something like that happening.
We might come back to that point. Thank you.
Yes.
Steve?
Yeah, we've spent quite a bit of time already on the problems of people on legacy benefits ending up in universal credit when maybe they shouldn't have. I'm just wondering, I find it quite astonishing that some organisations, I think it's Citizens Advice and Child Poverty Action, have complained about the Universal Credit Helpline actually wrongly advising people about what conditions or changes of circumstance necessitate a move.
Yeah.
I mean, how does that happen, and what needs to happen to stop that?
Yeah. I mean, I think you do have a lot of either new staff in job centres and on the helpline and the service centres, or existing staff retraining into universal credit and the like of it. Now, you know, we've talked about a few of the complexities of universal credit here today and the panel before, but those advisors on those helplines have to understand all of the complexities on it. So I do think there is a fundamental training issue here. The guidance as well is not always that clear that is provided to job centre advisors, and we're seeing things that were potentially old problems that have come back, never really went away that much, like things around confusion, particularly we mentioned earlier around right to reside and habitual residence. The front line of job centre staff are not well known for being very experienced on how to deal with those situations. We've always had to go to a layer behind in terms of decision makers or specific specialisms, and again all of that is coming through because you've got a mass movement of people moving from one system to the other. So we're seeing where it is more complex, a lack of knowledge and a lack of specialism to refer to those people, and then just more broadly a definite process of getting up to skill on the complexity of universal credit from job centre staff. And I mean, I hesitate to say this because they are clearly trying, and they've also got a volume of people moving through a system with not a lot of resources, but there is a challenge there. And the problem with universal credit is if it goes wrong, it can go really wrong. You're talking about extra delays of weeks on benefit claims if you get on it, or as we've talked about before, not being able to get back into the old system and facing not just a loss in time but an ongoing loss in terms of your income.
I mean, I'm not trying to castigate these people at all, but I mean, this is a government helpline. And these are people, government employees working in the job centre. If they can't tell me whether or not I should switch to universal credit, who can? And who should I trust?
It is difficult for a universal credit staff member to know whether someone should claim universal credit or not. If they're seeing that, they're dealing with that case for the very first time, you're expecting them to remember something that they only read about in guidance maybe a few weeks ago.
So should they be allowed to give that advice? I mean, is there any credible basis for giving advice if you don't know the answer and you couldn't possibly know it if you're seeing a person for the first time?
I quite agree with you, Steve. I don't think the job centre staff or the helpline staff should be giving advice on whether to claim universal credit because they are not benefits experts. We said already the job work coaches or employment support, the helpline staff follow a script and are call centre workers and they're not benefits experts. I think Nora sent in a chart that Newcastle Welfare Rights put together to try and explain all the triggers in universal credit. It's 5 pages long and has like 18 really detailed footnotes to it. And I've been doing advice for 30 years and I have to really sit down and think, what are the different options open to them? And it needs an experienced advisor. And I absolutely agree with you, they should not be advising people whether or not to claim universal credit. As government employees, obviously a member of the public is going to think, ringing the universal credit helpline, they know what they're talking about. And it's not a disrespect to the staff because that's just not what they're trained to do. And the staff under huge pressure. I don't really see that Wolverhampton and Walsall staff are coming out on strike because they're so overloaded. So not only there's maybe training issues, but they're just completely overworked. They've cut down the time they can have between calls. So they're down to take calls before they've dealt with the previous one.
Right.
So it's very difficult
for
for the staff as well.
On the government advice service, that this might damage your financial health if you follow what they tell you?
But I didn't quite get all that, sorry.
I said, are you saying that we should actually have a health warning on this government-sponsored advice service, that you use this advice service, but you may be worse off?
Yeah, I mean, I think they need to be clear that they're not speaking from a knowledgeable point of view. It's not fair to be on a universal credit helpline, speak to the member public and say, you should claim universal credit, when they have got options.
So who should give that?
I think it's got to be
people do need to go somewhere, don't they?
Yeah, I mean, obviously, hopefully the universal support, what Kayley's outlined, will help with that. whether it's going to be resourced enough to meet the needs of everyone, particularly tax credits do that. But it needs experienced advisors in job centres, in places where people can get advice, and they need to say, you need to see this person first before you make a decision. It's all too easy to go through that claim and press on that green submit button, and then...
And I think not understand that you
and
might
not understanding,
lose out.
Yeah, absolutely.
Should the presumption be that you don't advise someone to go on to universal credit unless you can be 100% certain they are going to be at least as well off or better off? Should that be the automatic
This is something we're seeing in Scotland. At least one of the job centres there, when people come in person, before they start the universal credit claim, they say go to the Citizens Advice Bureau, and they won't start the claim until they know that that person has been, particularly for people who have had their ESA stopped. And that's working very well because they have very good local connections and they can ensure a prompt appointment. So it may be that could be something that would work well across the country, but we're yet to see.
And I guess you're hoping that's how the universal support will work, ideally.
Yeah.
And the money used for this service given to you.
Yeah, so I think on this point, like, the key thing here is we've had to project demand, and that would require all claimants. Well, we haven't. The department have had to project demand, and there is a fixed budget on it, as has been alluded to, that wouldn't cover, in any sense, all claimants needing that before they made a claim. And there's another point here about protecting the start date of a claim during this process as well. We do want the department to make sure that the start of a universal credit claim is logged when somebody starts applying, not when they've completed an application, because this adds in another kind of stage onto that. So there are definite things there, but it would, this kind of thing in terms of looking at more and more claimants needing that support. Universal support was set up to help people who are struggling with the claims process, not necessarily to check whether universal credit is the right benefit for them, and that's not built into those resources.
Kayley, I think we can probably come back and do half the session just on universal support.
I think we'll start.
Rosie?
There's a kind of theme emerging that people are being pushed over to universal credit, yet time and time again we've been told on these panels and even in our visits that there's no targets. And what do you think are the motives for people pushing? Is it just lack of training to the staff? Are they just really, really encouraged? Or do you think perhaps there are targets, actually?
The training issue is probably the other way around. They've been trained in universal credit, but not necessarily in all of the legacy ones. So they're more likely to recommend the one that they know about.
There is a bit of just a mandatory change of circumstances, universal credit. I've had people say to me, your phone number's changed, you've got to claim universal credit. I've had that more than once. And as I said, I don't think it's ill will on the part of the work coaches, whoever. I just think it is lack of training, lack of understanding, and very much this push. Universal credit. There is a bit of a mantra from government that universal credit works for everybody, and people pick up on that, and then they think, oh well, we're doing them a favour, we're helping them on it. But as I say, and for some it might work really well, but for far too significant a minority with devastating results.
One last point to Kelly Marie. Can you tell us about the intelligence brief that you've got, what the information you're building up, and how it's fed out and to whom? Kelly.
Our early warning system has collated about 1,000 cases in the last 18 months from across England and Wales. The prevailing issues are, 90%... Who
feeds those to you?
That comes from various benefits advisors. So any benefits advisor who accesses our service, because we provide second-tier advice, so a benefit advisor who wants specialist welfare benefits legal know-how will call Child Poverty Action Group, or they may email, or just to let us know about their case, and also in contact with quite a lot of the forum members on RightsNet. So we get those cases from advisors in independent organisations, from local authorities and housing associations. We've also been getting them from social services and more recently from GPs as well, to highlight the issues that they're seeing around welfare reform. About 90% of cases we've received so far concern universal credit. We are getting, we talked about quite a lot already about seeing how people are worse off on universal credit, but we're also seeing a lot around the administrative errors in the universal credit. And I've been issuing regular e-bulletins where we summarise the issues that have been coming through, so that's available to the public, anyone who subscribes. And we also publish regular reports. I've got a 6-monthly report which is due to come out in the next couple of weeks, and we have started meeting with the department's external communications team regularly to strategise about some easy fixes that can be administered within the department without us having to take legal action.
Very good. We ought to sign up to it, didn't we? The committee. All right.
Could I just ask official error? Is bearing in mind we've got all these errors being made, which is understandable as you get new people moving into working for DWP and a new area. Is it right that claimants should not be able to claim for official error?
No.
I think we knew the answer to
yes.
that.
When were we going to say
yes? We've got it on record. Thank you all very much.
Thank
I
you.
think that this is about the universal support. Such an important question, and it could be built on in such an imaginative way, couldn't it?
Absolutely.
We give people correct advice instead of wrong advice.
To be clear, we think that, we welcome the funding, we welcome the opportunity to make sure people can get their claim in consistently across the country and get paid as quickly as possible. But we do not think it therefore means that we don't need fixes in the rest of universal credit or in that claims process, and we do not think it fills all support needs that are there for universal credit. So we welcome that.
It's most loyally pitched your requirements. All right. Thank you very much.
Thank you.